And as she kept moving forward, she began to understand that loving without losing yourself also requires letting go of who you think you need to be in order to be loved. That realization came quietly, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a steady release of pressure she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She stopped trying to be endlessly patient, stopped trying to be endlessly agreeable, stopped trying to be endlessly strong. She allowed herself to be human. Before, she believed love demanded endurance, that staying, adjusting, and absorbing discomfort was proof of commitment. Now she understood something deeper. Commitment without self-respect becomes self-erasure. So she learned to recognize the difference. Endurance was staying silent while her needs went unmet. Commitment was speaking up with honesty and care. Endurance was tolerating inconsistency. Commitment was choosing alignment. Endurance drained her. Commitment grounded her. She also realized that loving without losing yourself means accepting that not everyone will love the version of you who is whole. Some people preferred her when she was more accommodating, more available, less defined, and when she stopped being that person, they felt the absence, even if they couldn't name it. She no longer took that personally. She stopped shaping herself to fit other people's expectations. She stopped negotiating her values to avoid discomfort. Instead, she let people meet her where she stood, or not at all. This didn't make her less loving, it made her more honest. She began to notice how love felt in her body now. Less tension, less anticipation of disappointment, less need to prepare for emotional impact. Love felt calmer, more spacious, more mutual. And in that calm, she realized how much chaos she had once mistaken for passion. Loving without losing yourself also means learning to pause before reacting. She didn't rush to fix misunderstandings. She didn't rush to explain herself when she felt unseen. She allowed time and clarity to do their work. This patience wasn't indifference, it was confidence. As her sense of self strengthened, she became more discerning about access. Not everyone deserved immediate closeness. Not everyone needed to know everything. Not every relationship required full emotional investment. This wasn't about being guarded, it was about being intentional. She learned that love does not ask you to abandon your dreams, your voice, or your direction. If a connection required that kind of sacrifice, it wasn't aligned. And alignment mattered more to her now than attachment. There were moments when she missed the intensity of how she used to love. The rush, the feeling of being consumed, the sense of being needed. But she also remembered the cost, the exhaustion, the anxiety, the quiet loss of self, and that memory anchored her. She discovered that loving without losing yourself allows space for individuality within connection. She could have her own thoughts, routines, and inner world without threatening closeness. She no longer felt guilty for needing time alone. Solitude became nourishment, not absence. As she continued practicing this way of loving, her relationships became mirrors instead of battlegrounds. They reflected her growth. They revealed where she still needed healing. They showed her how far she'd come. She also learned that loving without losing yourself means staying curious instead of defensive. When conflict arose, she listened, not to submit, but to understand. She expressed herself not to win, but to be seen. And when understanding wasn't possible, she accepted that too. Over time, she stopped measuring love by how much she gave. She measured it by how safe she felt being herself. This safety changed how she showed up. She was softer without being fragile, stronger without being rigid, open without being unprotected. She realized that the version of herself who once disappeared in love was not weak. She was learning, and now she was choosing differently. Loving without losing yourself is not a perfect formula. It's a living practice. Some days she leaned too far back, some days she overgave, but each time she returned to herself faster, and that return mattered more than perfection. As the story continued, she understood that the greatest act of love she could offer to anyone was staying connected to herself, because from that place, love flowed freely, not as sacrifice, not as survival, but as choice. And as long as she continued honoring that choice, learning, adjusting, listening, and growing, the story would keep unfolding, revealing deeper layers of intimacy, clarity, and self-trust, guiding her forward into relationships that felt like home rather than hiding places, and into a life where love no longer required disappearance, because she had learned how to love without losing herself. And as the days passed, she began to notice something else, something quieter, but just as powerful. She no longer felt the need to rush love. The urgency that once lived in her chest had softened. She wasn't chasing connection to avoid emptiness anymore. She was allowing connection to arrive when it felt mutual, steady, and real. This was new territory. Before, love had always felt like something she had to secure. Now, it felt like something she could welcome. She started paying attention to how she felt during relationships, not just how she felt about them. Did she feel calm or constantly alert? Did she feel safe to express herself or afraid of disrupting the balance? Did she feel energized or emotionally depleted? These questions became her compass. And when the answers didn't align, she listened. Loving without losing yourself also meant letting go of the fantasy that being needed was the same as being loved. She had once confused importance with dependence. She thought being indispensable meant being valued, but she learned that love rooted in dependency is fragile. Real love does not require you to be needed, it allows you to be chosen. As she grew more grounded, her boundaries became quieter. She didn't announce them, she didn't defend them, she lived them, and the people who respected them stayed. The ones who didn't slowly faded. This process was not dramatic, it was honest. There were moments when old patterns tried to resurface, moments when she felt the urge to over-explain, to fix discomfort, to give more than she had, but now she paused. She reminded herself that love does not require self-neglect, and she chose differently. She also learned that loving without losing yourself means allowing others to feel their emotions without taking responsibility for them. She no longer rushed to soothe every discomfort. She no longer absorbed moods that weren't hers. She allowed people to sit with their feelings. This was an act of respect for them and for herself. Her relationships became more balanced. There was room for disagreement without fear, space for individuality without distance, connection without control. And in that balance, she felt more at ease. She noticed how much lighter her love felt now. It wasn't weighed down by expectation. It wasn't driven by fear. It wasn't fueled by self-sacrifice. It was intentional. Loving without losing yourself also means knowing when to stop giving. Not because you don't care, but because you do. You care enough to protect your energy, to honor your limits, to preserve your sense of self. As she continued walking this path, she realized that love is not proven by how much you endure. It is proven by how well you remain yourself. She no longer equated intensity with depth. She recognized that depth lives in consistency, in respect, in the quiet presence of someone who doesn't make you question your worth. She also became more patient with love and with herself. She stopped expecting perfection. She stopped fearing mistakes. She understood that loving well is something you practice, not something you master overnight. There were still moments of loneliness, moments when choosing herself felt isolating, moments when being whole felt heavier than disappearing. But those moments passed, and what remained was a sense of integrity. She began to trust that love aligned with her wholeness would not require performance. She wouldn't have to shrink, soften, or silence herself to keep it. She would be met, not managed. And as this trust deepened, her heart opened in a new way, not recklessly, not defensively, but honestly. She realized that loving without losing yourself is not about controlling how others love you. It's about controlling how you show up for yourself. As the story continued, she understood that every relationship from here on would be shaped by this foundation. self-awareness, boundaries, compassion. And with that foundation, love became something that expanded her life instead of consuming it. The journey was still unfolding. There were more lessons ahead, more connections to explore, more ways to practice this balance. But now she walked forward, rooted in herself, open to love, but no longer willing to disappear inside it, trusting that this way of loving would continue to guide her, teach her, and shape her as the story carried on. And as the story moved forward, she began to understand that loving without losing yourself is not a destination. It is a daily practice, a series of small, conscious choices made in ordinary moments. The choice to pause before agreeing, the choice to speak even when her voice trembled, the choice to rest without guilt. These choices didn't feel heroic. They felt subtle, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes lonely, but they were shaping a new way of being. She noticed how her body responded when she honored herself. Her chest felt lighter, her breath deeper, her thoughts less frantic. She realized that anxiety had once been her body's way of telling her she was leaving herself behind. Now, presence replaced panic. Loving without losing yourself also meant releasing the idea that love should complete you. She had once leaned into relationships to fill empty spaces, to quiet self-doubt, to feel anchored. But now, she was learning how to be anchored within herself. Love became something she shared, not something she clung to. She also learned that self-respect and vulnerability are not opposites. You can open your heart without handing it over. You can be honest without overexposing. You can care deeply without sacrificing your center. This balance was unfamiliar at first, but with practice, it became natural. Some relationships deepened as she changed, others faded, and while that still hurt, it no longer confused her. She understood now that alignment reveals itself over time. Not everyone is meant to grow with you, and that's okay. She stopped trying to be understood by everyone. She realized that the right people wouldn't need convincing. They would feel her honesty instead of questioning it. She also stopped apologizing for taking up space, for having needs, for needing time, for choosing herself. These were not flaws. They were boundaries. There were moments when she looked back at who she used to be, the version of herself that disappeared in love. And instead of shame, she felt compassion. That version was brave in her own way. She loved without fear, and now she loved with wisdom. Loving without losing yourself, she learned, sometimes means choosing solitude over connection that drains you. It means sitting with your own thoughts instead of filling silence with noise. It means trusting that being alone for a while is healthier than being lost in the wrong company. As she continued to grow, she noticed that her standards weren't higher, they were clearer. She didn't need perfection. She needed respect, consistency, emotional availability, and she was no longer willing to negotiate those things away. She also learned to let relationships unfold instead of rushing them. She no longer forced closeness. She allowed trust to build naturally, and when it didn't, she didn't chase it. She let it be. The fear of abandonment that once guided her choices began to loosen its grip, not because she stopped caring, but because she trusted herself to survive loss. She trusted herself to choose again, and with that trust came freedom. Freedom to love openly without clinging. Freedom to set boundaries without guilt. Freedom to walk away without self-blame. Loving without losing yourself doesn't mean you never get hurt. It means you don't abandon yourself when you are. It means you stay present with your pain instead of numbing it. It means you choose honesty over comfort. As her journey continued, she realized that the most important love story she would ever live was not the one she shared with someone else. It was the one she cultivated within, and as long as she honored that relationship through boundaries, through courage, through compassion, she could love others without losing herself. The path ahead was still unfolding. There would be new challenges, new connections, new lessons, but now she walked forward grounded, carrying love without disappearing into it. choosing connection without self-erasure, and trusting that this way of loving would continue to reveal itself, one choice at a time, as the story moved on, still unfinished, still alive, still becoming. And as that unfolding continued, she began to notice how different her days felt when she no longer abandoned herself for the sake of harmony. There was a quiet steadiness in her mornings now. She woke up less anxious, less rushed to prove that she was enough. The constant mental checklist, did I say the right thing? Did I give too much? Did I ask for too much? Started to fade. She realized how much energy she had spent monitoring herself. Now, she redirected that energy inward, loving without losing yourself. She learned requires a relationship with your own inner voice. For years, she had ignored it whenever it whispered discomfort. She brushed it aside in favor of keeping things smooth. She mistook peacekeeping for peace. But peace that cost you your voice is not peace. So she began listening again. When something felt off, she paused. When something hurt, she acknowledged it. When she needed space, she took it. And with every small act of honesty, she felt herself returning. At first, there was fear. Fear that loving this way would push people away. Fear that setting boundaries would be seen as rejection. Fear that being whole would make her harder to love. But something unexpected happened. The people who truly cared adjusted. The ones who couldn't, didn't. And instead of blaming herself, she finally understood not every connection is meant to survive your growth. She also realized that loving without losing yourself means letting go of control. Control over outcomes. Control over how you're perceived. Control over whether someone stays. She had once believed that if she just loved well enough, patient enough, kind enough, flexible enough, she could secure love, but love doesn't work that way. You cannot earn alignment by erasing yourself. She learned to sit with uncertainty, to love without guarantees, to show up without clinging, to care deeply without losing her center. This was a different kind of strength. As she grew more grounded, her relationships changed texture. Conversations felt more honest. Silences felt less threatening. Distance no longer felt like abandonment because she wasn't measuring her worth by someone else's presence anymore. She started noticing patterns she once ignored, how she was drawn to people who needed saving, how she confused intensity with intimacy, how she overgave to feel secure. And instead of judging herself, she observed with compassion. These patterns weren't flaws, they were learned survival strategies, and now she was learning new ones. Loving without losing yourself also meant learning when to walk away. Not in anger, not dramatically, but with clarity. She stopped forcing closeness where respect was missing. She stopped explaining herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. And walking away no longer felt like failure, it felt like alignment. She also learned that love does not require constant access. You can care deeply and still need space. You can be committed and still maintain independence. You can be connected and still choose yourself. This understanding freed her from the fear that boundaries meant disconnection. Boundaries, she realized, were what made connection sustainable. Over time, she became more selective, not guarded, but discerning. She asked herself questions she had never asked before. Do I feel safe being myself here? Can I express my needs without fear? Is this relationship expanding me or shrinking me? And if the answers didn't align, she listened. She began to trust that the right kind of love would not ask her to disappear. It would meet her where she stood. It would respect her pace. It would welcome her wholeness. As she continued learning, she also learned to forgive herself for the time she had lost herself before. She didn't know then what she knows now. She was loving the only way she knew how, and now she was choosing differently. There were still moments of doubt, moments when old habits tempted her to overgive, moments when silence triggered old fears, moments when being whole felt lonely, but she stayed with herself. And as she stayed, something shifted. She no longer felt the need to chase love. She allowed it to meet her. Loving without losing yourself, she discovered, is not about building walls. It's about building roots. Roots in self-trust, roots in clarity, roots in the knowledge that you are already enough. And from those roots, love grows healthier. As this story continued, through missteps, through moments of courage, through quiet acts of self-respect, she realized that the most important relationship she would ever nurture was the one she had with herself. And as long as she honored that relationship, she could love freely, deeply, and honestly without losing herself again. And still, the journey wasn't over. There were more lessons ahead, more love to learn, more ways to choose herself. And so, the story continued, not because she looked different, but because she felt hollow. She tried to remember the last time she had spoken freely, without calculating the impact. The last time she had made a decision without considering whether it would inconvenience someone else. The last time she had felt fully present in her own life. She couldn't, and that scared her. Love was supposed to add to her life, not erase it. So she began asking questions she had been avoiding. When did I stop doing the things that mattered to me? When did my needs become optional? When did love start to feel like self-erasure instead of connection? The answers weren't loud, they arrived slowly, in moments of quiet clarity. She realized she had confused sacrifice with love. She had believed that loving someone meant constantly adjusting herself, smoothing out her edges, making herself easier to hold, even if it meant becoming smaller. But love was never meant to require disappearance. She didn't stop loving him. That's the part that surprised her. She still cared, still felt tenderness, still wanted closeness, but she began to love differently. It started with small acts of return. She said no when she needed to rest. She spoke up when something didn't feel right. She chose her own plans without apology. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost selfish. She worried she was becoming distant. She worried she was ruining the connection. But something else happened instead. She began to feel more like herself. She realized that love without self-respect slowly becomes resentment. And she didn't want to resent the person she loved. So she practiced something new, boundaries, not walls, not ultimatums, just clear lines that said, this is where I end and you begin. Some days, he met her with understanding. Other days, he didn't. And that was another lesson she had to learn. Love cannot survive if it only exists when you are agreeable. She learned that loving without losing yourself requires presence with yourself first. It requires checking in. It requires honesty. It requires courage, because staying whole in love is harder than disappearing. She stopped chasing reassurance and started trusting her own voice. She stopped over-explaining and started standing firm, and slowly the dynamic changed. She no longer loved from fear, fear of abandonment, fear of being too much, fear of being left behind. She loved from choice. Some people noticed the difference. She's changed, they said, and they were right. She had, but she hadn't become colder. She had become clearer. Loving without losing yourself doesn't mean loving less. It means loving with boundaries, with self-awareness, with the understanding that your needs are not obstacles to love. They are part of it. She began to understand that true intimacy doesn't ask you to disappear. It invites you to show up fully. And as she continued walking this path, learning how to love while staying rooted in who she was, learning how to choose connection without self-betrayal, she realized that this story wasn't about one relationship. It was about her relationship with herself, and that story was still unfolding, revealing new lessons, new challenges, and new strength with every step forward as she continued learning how to love deeply without losing herself. How to love without losing yourself. She didn't realize she was disappearing at first. It happened quietly, in small adjustments that felt harmless in the moment. She laughed a little softer so she wouldn't seem too much. She waited longer before speaking up. She rearranged her schedule, her priorities, her opinions, just enough to make space for someone else, just enough to keep the peace. She told herself this was love, because love, she believed, meant compromise. And compromise, she thought, meant bending, but she didn't notice when bending became breaking. She had always been someone who loved deeply, not loudly, not desperately, but fully. When she chose someone, she chose them with intention. She listened carefully, remembered details, made room for their emotions, even when she barely understood her own. At first, it felt beautiful. There was closeness, shared dreams, a sense of belonging she hadn't known before. And in that warmth, she didn't notice how often she put herself second. Loving him meant adapting. It meant being patient when she felt dismissed. It meant understanding when he pulled away. It meant reassuring him even when she was the one who felt unsure. She became good at reading the room, good at anticipating moods, good at keeping things calm, and people praised her for it. She's so understanding. She's so easy to love. But what they didn't see was how tired she felt when she was alone. One night, she caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she felt hollow. She tried to remember the last time she had spoken freely without calculating the impact. The last time she had made a decision without considering whether it would inconvenience someone else. The last time she had felt fully present in her own life, she couldn't, and that scared her. Love was supposed to add to her life, not erase it. So she began asking questions she had been avoiding. When did I stop doing the things that matter to me? When did my needs become optional? When did love start to feel like self-erasure instead of connection? The answers weren't loud. They arrived slowly in moments of quiet clarity. She realized she had confused sacrifice with love. She had believed that loving someone meant constantly adjusting herself, smoothing out her edges, making herself easier to hold, even if it meant becoming smaller. But love was never meant to require disappearance. She didn't stop loving him. That's the part that surprised her. She still cared, still felt tenderness, still wanted closeness, but she began to love differently. It started with small acts of return. She said no when she needed to rest. She spoke up when something didn't feel right. She chose her own plans without apology. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost selfish. She worried she was becoming distant. She worried she was ruining the connection. But something else happened instead. She began to feel more like herself. She realized that love without self-respect slowly becomes resentment, and she didn't want to resent the person she loved. So she practiced something new. Boundaries, not walls, not ultimatums. Just clear lines that said, this is where I end and you begin. Some days he met her with understanding. Other days, he didn't. And that was another lesson she had to learn. Love cannot survive if it only exists when you are agreeable. She learned that loving without losing yourself requires presence with yourself first. It requires checking in. It requires honesty. It requires courage. Because staying whole in love is harder than disappearing. She stopped chasing reassurance and started trusting her own voice. She stopped over-explaining and started standing firm. And slowly, the dynamic changed. She no longer loved from fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being too much. Fear of being left behind. She loved from choice. Some people noticed the difference. She's changed, they said. And they were right. She had, but she hadn't become colder. She had become clearer. Loving without losing yourself doesn't mean loving less. It means loving with boundaries, with self-awareness, with the understanding that your needs are not obstacles to love. They are part of it. She began to understand that true intimacy doesn't ask you to disappear. It invites you to show up fully. And as she continued walking this path, learning how to love while staying rooted in who she was, learning how to choose connection without self-betrayal, she realized that this story wasn't about one relationship. It was about her relationship with herself. And that story was still unfolding, revealing new lessons, new challenges, and new strength with every step forward as she continued learning how to love deeply without losing herself. As this understanding deepens, you realize that becoming the closure is not a one-time decision. It's a practice a practice of choosing presence over rumination, a practice of choosing self-trust over external validation, a practice of choosing peace over unfinished conversations. And some days, it's easier than others. But each time you choose it, you strengthen that muscle. You begin to see that the need for closure was never about answers. It was about safety. And now, you are learning how to create that safety within yourself. And as long as you continue choosing that inner stability, this journey keeps unfolding, not perfectly, not without moments of doubt, but with intention, with clarity, with the quiet confidence that you do not need someone else to complete a chapter they already walked away from. You are capable of closing it yourself. And as you keep moving forward, step by step, moment by moment, honoring your boundaries, trusting your instincts, releasing the need to be understood by those who could not meet you with honesty. This story continues, leading you further away from the need for explanations and closer to a version of yourself who no longer waits for closure because you have become it. And becoming it changes the way you walk through the world. You no longer move with hesitation, wondering if the past will reach out and pull you backward. You no longer live with one foot in yesterday and one foot in tomorrow. You are finally standing where you are, fully present, fully grounded. You start to notice how often people mistake closure for control. They want answers so they can rewrite the ending. They want explanations so they can soothe the ego. They want apologies so the pain feels justified. But control is not healing. Healing is surrendering the need to manage how the past should have unfolded and accepting how it did. And that acceptance is not passive, it is powerful. When you stop chasing closure, you also stop negotiating with memory. You no longer ask, what if I had said this? You no longer wonder, what if I had stayed? You no longer bargain with moments that are already gone. You understand now that clarity does not come from rewriting history. It comes from understanding patterns, and the pattern was clear enough to walk away. Becoming the closure also means allowing yourself to feel without needing resolution. You let sadness pass without attaching it to longing. You let anger surface without needing confrontation. You let grief exist without demanding explanation. You stop fearing emotions because you are no longer trapped by them. They move through you instead of owning you. You begin to see how much strength it takes to accept unanswered endings. Anyone can demand explanations. Anyone can reopen wounds. But it takes maturity to say, I don't need this to make sense to move on. That is emotional independence. There is a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable, when you realize you are no longer waiting. You don't check your phone for messages that won't come. You don't imagine conversations that will never happen. You don't feel that pull to revisit what already closed. And when you notice that absence, you realize how far you've come. Becoming the closure does not erase love. It simply releases attachment to outcome. You can honor what was real without demanding it return. You can appreciate what you felt without needing it explained. You can value the lesson without reliving the pain. This is not detachment, it is integration. You also stop needing others to agree with your decision. You no longer explain why you left. You no longer defend your healing. You no longer seek validation for choosing peace. You trust yourself enough to stand by your choice. At times, the world will pressure you to reopen doors, to clear the air, to get answers, to have one last conversation. But you know now that not all conversations bring clarity. Some only reopen wounds. And you are allowed to protect yourself from that. As you embody this mindset, you become someone who finishes chapters cleanly, not because they were simple, but because you chose not to live inside unfinished endings. You don't drag pain into new beginnings. You don't punish the present for the past. You don't let old confusion distort new connections. You arrive lighter. Becoming the closure also means recognizing that you were never wrong for wanting answers. You were human. You wanted understanding because you cared. You wanted meaning because the connection mattered. But now you understand that caring does not require clinging, and meaning does not require explanation. You begin to trust that some experiences were meant to teach, not to stay. That some people were meant to reveal, not remain. And that understanding gives you peace. You stop romanticizing unfinished stories. You stop assigning destiny to confusion. You stop calling lack of communication complex. You call things what they are, and that honesty is healing. There is freedom in realizing that closure is not something you wait for. It is something you decide. Decide to stop revisiting. Decide to stop hoping for different endings. Decide to stop giving energy to what has already shown you its limits. And this decision doesn't harden you. It softens you in the right places. You become more available to what is present, more open to what is aligned, more receptive to clarity when it appears. And as you continue walking forward, becoming stronger, clearer, more grounded in who you are and what you deserve, you realize that closure was never something you needed to find at the end of the story. It was something you needed to become within yourself. And this realization doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, through moments of restraint, through choosing not to look back, through trusting that peace is more valuable than answers. And as long as you keep choosing yourself over unanswered questions, choosing growth over rumination, choosing acceptance over explanation, this journey continues, leading you further away from the pain that once held you and closer to a version of yourself that no longer waits for endings to be explained because you have learned how to end them yourself, to be continued. And in that continuation, you begin to notice how different your days feel when you are no longer mentally reaching backward. Your mind is no longer trapped in what ifs and maybes. Your energy is no longer split between the present and a past that cannot be revised. There is more space now, space to breathe, to think clearly, to imagine a future that is not anchored to unanswered questions. You start realizing how heavy the chase for closure actually was. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. The tight chest, the restless nights, the constant mental looping. And when you stop chasing, your body feels it first. Your shoulders drop, your breathing deepens, your nervous system slowly begins to calm. This is what peace feels like when it arrives quietly. Becoming the closure also means accepting that some people will never understand the impact they had on you, not because it wasn't significant, but because they lack the self-awareness to reflect honestly. And instead of trying to make them understand, you choose to understand yourself. You name what hurt. You acknowledge what was lost. You validate your own experience. You no longer need someone else to witness your pain for it to be real. As you stop chasing closure, you also stop chasing validation. You stop wanting them to admit they were wrong. You stop wanting them to see your worth. You stop wanting them to regret losing you, because you realize something freeing. Their awareness does not define your value. You begin to redefine what moving on actually means. It doesn't mean pretending it didn't matter. It doesn't mean rushing into something new to fill the space. It doesn't mean forcing positivity. Moving on means allowing the story to end without rewriting it. It means letting grief exist without feeding it. It means honoring what was without living inside it. You also learn that closure does not mean forgiveness in the way people often expect. Forgiveness is not excusing behavior. It's not reconciling. It's not reopening communication. Sometimes forgiveness is simply releasing yourself from the need to carry anger into your future. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's personal, sometimes it never involves the other person at all. Becoming the closure means choosing boundaries over explanations. You stop feeling the need to justify why you walked away. You stop defending your decision to protect your peace. You stop arguing with people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You let your absence be the explanation. At first, this can feel uncomfortable because for so long, you were conditioned to explain yourself, to make things easier for others, to soften your truth so it would be accepted. But clarity does not require permission, and boundaries do not require agreement. You may also notice that as you stop chasing closure, some people try to pull you back into old conversations. They ask questions, they test boundaries, they reopen topics, you've already closed. And this is where your growth is tested. Do you re-enter the cycle? Or do you remain grounded in what you've already decided? Becoming the closure means choosing not to re-engage in dynamics that no longer serve you. There is strength in not responding, strength in not explaining, strength in not reopening wounds that you've already worked to heal. Silence, in this context, is not avoidance, it's self-respect. As you continue to embody this, you become more present. You show up more fully in your life, in your relationships, in your goals. You stop carrying the emotional weight of unfinished conversations into spaces that deserve your full attention. And people notice not because you announce it, but because your energy changes. You no longer feel rushed to resolve everything. You understand that some answers come with time and some never come at all, and both outcomes can be survived. Becoming the closure also reshapes how you approach future relationships. You communicate earlier, you notice red flags faster, you don't invest deeply where clarity is absent. You no longer build connections on potential alone. You value transparency, consistency, emotional accountability. You understand now that love without clarity creates anxiety, and peace should never require you to chase understanding. There will still be moments when memory pulls you backward, a song, a place, a familiar phrase, and when that happens, you don't fight it, you acknowledge it. You let the feeling pass without attaching meaning to it. You remind yourself this is a memory, not a direction. You are no longer waiting for someone else to close the door. You closed it yourself. Gently, deliberately, without needing applause, and in doing so, you didn't lose something, you gained something: agency, clarity, emotional freedom. You learned that closure is not about endings being neat. It's about choosing not to live in the mess. There comes a moment in life when you realize that waiting for answers is costing you more than the truth ever did. You replay conversations, you revisit memories, you imagine one final explanation that will finally make everything make sense. You tell yourself, if I just understand why, I can move on. But here's the hard truth. Closure rarely comes from the people who hurt you. And the longer you chase it, the longer you stay tied to the pain. That's why the real shift doesn't happen when someone gives you answers. It happens when you stop asking for them. We are taught to believe that closure is a conversation, an apology, a confession, a moment where the other person finally admits what they did wrong and validates your pain. But life doesn't always work that way. Some people leave without explanation. Some people disappear instead of taking responsibility. Some people hurt you and never look back, and if your healing depends on their clarity, you hand them power they may never give back. Chasing closure keeps you emotionally stuck. It keeps you reliving the same chapter, hoping the ending will change. It keeps you waiting for someone else to resolve what only you can release. It keeps your healing conditional on someone else's awareness, and that's not peace, that's emotional dependence. Here's what no one tells you. Sometimes the silence is the answer. Sometimes the way they left is the explanation. Sometimes the lack of effort is the truth. Not everything needs to be explained to be understood. Closure doesn't always arrive as clarity. Often, it arrives as acceptance. Acceptance that they couldn't meet you where you were. Acceptance that the apology you deserved may never come. Acceptance that understanding why won't undo what happened. And once you accept that, you stop bleeding into places that can't heal you. Chasing closure keeps hope alive in the wrong direction. Hope that they'll finally explain, hope that they'll regret it, hope that they'll come back differently. But hope without action keeps you waiting. And waiting keeps you stuck between what was and what could have been. Becoming the closure means deciding that you don't need their permission to move forward. It means you stop asking questions that reopen wounds. It means you stop returning to memories that keep you anchored in pain. It means you stop expecting someone who avoided accountability once to suddenly offer it now. Closure is not something you receive, it's something you claim. Becoming the closure means choosing peace over answers. It means saying, I may never understand why, but I understand how it made me feel, and that is enough. It means honoring your experience, even when it's invalidated. It means trusting your perception, even when it was dismissed. You don't need confirmation to validate your pain. You don't need one last conversation. You don't need one last message. You don't need one last explanation. What you need is permission to let go. And that permission does not come from them. It comes from you. When you stop chasing closure, you reclaim your energy. Energy you spent overthinking. Energy you spent replaying scenarios. Energy you spent trying to make sense of something that wasn't built to make sense. You redirect that energy inward, toward healing, toward growth, toward building a life that doesn't revolve around unanswered questions. Becoming the closure also means accepting a painful truth. Some people don't have the emotional depth to give you the ending you want. And that doesn't mean your pain wasn't real. It means they were incapable of meeting you with honesty. Understanding that frees you. Closure doesn't always feel peaceful at first. Sometimes it feels like grief, like disappointment, like the final realization that the story ended without resolution, but unresolved endings still end. And endings, whether clean or messy, still create space for new beginnings. When you become the closure, you stop chasing people who walked away. You stop asking for explanations from people who avoided responsibility. You stop hoping for accountability from those who lacked it. You accept what is instead of longing for what should have been. And acceptance is not weakness, it's clarity. You begin to understand that healing doesn't require understanding everything. It requires releasing what no longer serves you. You don't need the full picture to move on. You only need enough clarity to know that staying stuck hurts more than letting go. Becoming the closure also means forgiving yourself. Forgiving yourself for staying too long, for ignoring red flags, for hoping when evidence told you otherwise. You were not foolish. You were human, and now you are wiser. As you stop chasing closure, your standards rise. You stop romanticizing confusion. You stop tolerating silence as communication. You stop mistaking avoidance for mystery. You begin to value clarity, consistency, and emotional honesty. You stop reopening doors that hurt you. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about your peace. You realize that closure is not about what they say, it's about what you decide. You decide that your healing will not depend on someone else's awareness. You decide that your peace will not wait for their apology. You decide that your future will not be delayed by their silence. And that decision changes everything. Becoming the closure means trusting that some lessons don't come with explanations, they come with transformation. They come with growth, with boundaries, with self-respect. They come with the understanding that not everything broken needs to be fixed. Some things need to be released. And as you continue forward, you may still feel moments of doubt. Moments where you wonder if one more conversation would help. Moments where you wish things ended differently. But you remind yourself, if closure were coming from them, it would have already arrived. So you stop chasing, you stop asking, you stop waiting. And in that stillness, something powerful happens. You heal. Not because everything made sense, but because you chose to move on anyway. And as your story continues to unfold, you understand something that once felt impossible. The pain that changed you was not a curse. It was a passage into self-awareness, into resilience, into clarity. And while you may never be grateful for the pain itself, you are grateful for the strength it revealed in you. So you keep moving forward, not perfectly, not without moments of doubt, but with intention. You keep choosing growth over bitterness. You keep choosing truth over comfort. You keep choosing to believe that your story is still unfolding, because it is. And there are chapters ahead that will feel lighter. Chapters that will remind you why you endured. Chapters filled with connection, peace, and purpose that only someone who has been through the fire could truly appreciate. And as long as you keep walking, carrying the lessons, releasing the weight, trusting the process, this journey continues, shaping you gently now instead of violently, teaching you that pain was never meant to be your ending, only your transformation, and that who you are becoming is still revealing itself, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath,